Hi, hello guys, how are you all? ஸோ நேற்று தான் சீஸ்ஃபயர் 5 மணிக்கு மேலேன்னு சொன்னாங்க. நேற்று நைட்லேருந்தே பல இடத்துல வந்து கன் ஷாட்ஸு, வயலேஷன், ஷெல்லிங்கு, எக்ஸ்ப்ளோஷன்ஸ் இதெல்லாமே வந்து ஜேஎன்கே அண்ட் பஞ்சாப் ஸ்டேட்டில் இருந்ததுன்னு சொல்லிட்டு நியூஸ் நேற்றே வந்துருந்துச்சு. நேற்றே பயங்கரமாக வேர்ல்டு நியூஸ் சொல்லப்படுற அல்ஜசீரா ஆகட்டும், இல்லை டிடபிள்யூ ஆகட்டும், நிறைய பேர் கவர் பண்ணியிருந்தாங்க. ஆக்சுவலி இந்த மாதிரி சீஸ்ஃபயர் வயலேஷன் இருக்குது பிட்வீன் இந்தியா அண்ட் பாகிஸ்தான், தே ப்ளேம் ஈச் அதர்னு சொல்லிட்டு. ஸோ என்ன நியூஸ், அது என்ன கதை அப்படிங்கிறது எல்லாத்தையும் நம்ம பார்ப்போம் வாங்க. லெட்ஸ் கோ இன்டு த நியூஸ் ரியாக்ட். இந்தியா பாகிஸ்தான் ஸ்மிங்ஸ் ஆர் மேனேஜபிள். என்ன கதை, புது கதையாக இருக்குது. ஸ்கை நியூஸில் தான் சொல்லியிருக்காங்க. இந்தியா பாகிஸ்தான் சீஸ்ஃபயர் பிளாஸ்ட் ரிப்போர்ட்ஸ் ஆஃப்டர் ட்ரூஸ். நான் சொன்னல அல்ஜசீரா அவங்களும் ரிப்போர்ட் பண்ணியிருக்காங்க. ஃபஸ்ட்டு அல்ஜசீராவில் ஆரம்பிப்போம், and then we'll go into this Sky News as well. Come on, Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera, what do you have for us?
Just hours after fire agreement was announced, projectiles in the night sky of Indian administrative ceasefire agreement was announced, projectiles in the night sky of Indian administrative. Just hours after a ceasefire agreement was announced, projectiles in the night sky of Indian administered Kashmir. India's foreign secretary is calling on Pakistan to stop what he called violations and says India's armed forces have been given instructions to respond.
ஏன் இவ்வளோ பஃபராக கொஞ்சம் தான் உன்னைய 2 நிமிஷம் தான் உன்னைய லோட் பண்ண சொன்னேன். அதுக்கேன்ப்பா நீ இவ்வளோ பஃபர் ஆகிட்டுருக்க? ஒன்றும் இல்லை, ஒரு சின்ன கிளிச்சு. திணறுது, அப்படியே திணறுது. போகலாமா? எனக்கு இந்த ஸ்ட்ரீம் கரெக்டாக போகும்னு தோணலை. ஃபுல் அண்ட் ஃபுல் பஃபரில் தான் இருக்கும். பட் ஸ்டில் ஐம் ஜஸ்ட் கோயிங், ஒரு பிளைண்ட் ஃபெய்த் அப்படி நான் போகிறேன்.
Just hours after a ceasefire agreement was announced, projectiles in the night sky of Indian administered Kashmir. India's foreign secretary is calling on Pakistan to stop what he calls violations and says India's armed forces have been given instructions to respond.
There have been repeated violations of the understanding arrived at earlier this evening between the Directors General of Military Operations of India and Pakistan. This is a breach of the understanding arrived at earlier today.
And there were celebrations on the streets of Pakistan after US President Donald Trump announced an end to the fighting on his social media platform, Truth Social.
We found out via social media and Donald Trump's tweet. We are happy to see this. This is a good thing. Nobody wants war. No solution could be found with war. It is only through dialogue. Talks and dialogue are the only way to find a solution.
The fighting erupted after India accused Pakistan of being behind an attack on tourists that killed 26 people in Indian administered Kashmir last month. But Islamabad has denied any involvement. India mounted attacks on several Pakistani locations, describing them as terrorist hideouts. Pakistan said the dozens who were killed were innocent civilians.
Wait for our response.
And retaliated by attacking targets.
We have acted as a responsible state for the world and regional peace and stability, and for the millions of people's lives in the region who gave a positive response on a ceasefire suggestion.
With the two sides claiming the same piece of territory for 80 years, this conflict runs deeper than any officially agreed truce. But with nuclear weapons on both sides, the pressure is on for India and Pakistan to make this ceasefire work. Mohammed Val, Al Jazeera.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get
Off with the latest from Asia, where there are real fears that a ceasefire between two nuclear-armed neighbors is unraveling just hours after coming into effect. Earlier today, India and Pakistan agreed to a U.S.-brokered truce to pause a wave of deadly attacks focused on Kashmir, a region that's been the subject of a territorial dispute between the two countries for decades. Word of the ceasefire initially led to relief, even celebration. Then this happened after darkness fell. This video shows multiple explosions in the sky over Indian-controlled Kashmir. Locals reporting they had seen projectiles, possibly even drones. The chief minister of the region posted online, "This is no ceasefire. The air defense units have just opened up." A blackout was immediately put into effect in Indian-controlled Kashmir, as well as the western border state of Gujarat. India's foreign secretary is accusing Pakistan of repeated ceasefire violations and says his country's armed forces stand ready to respond.
This is a breach of the understanding arrived at earlier today. The armed forces are giving an adequate and appropriate response to these violations, and we take very, very serious notice of these violations. We call upon Pakistan to take appropriate steps to address these violations and deal with the situation with seriousness and responsibility. The armed forces are maintaining a strong vigil on the situation. They have been given instructions to deal strongly with any instances of a repetition of the violations of the borders along the international border as well as the line of control.
जो इंसान दुश्मनी जारहियत.
That's Pakistan's Prime Minister addressing his nation and claiming its military had achieved, quote, a historical victory over India. He also suggested Pakistan is a peaceful nation and that he remains positive about the ceasefire. A foreign affairs spokesman went a little further, saying Pakistan is committed to the truce. Our South Asian correspondent, Shivji, is closely following this story. She's in Mumbai and tells us how we reached this point.
It's important to note, of course, that violence over Kashmir ebbs and flows. There are moments in time where this flares up. It has been a very long-standing dispute. But in this case in particular, it was a militant attack that happened last month in April, on April 22nd. It was in the Indian-controlled side of Kashmir, which has seen decades of violent armed insurgency. It was in a town called Pahalgam, which is a very beautiful tourist spot, and it was tourists that were actually targeted by these militants, 3 men who actually killed 6 men. Mostly all of them were tourists. And the chilling details of that attack actually did shock and anger a lot of people here in India, because it was reported from survivors that the men were singled out. They were reportedly singled out because they were Hindu. So the religious nature of this divide very present here. And then there was a lot of pressure on India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi to retaliate. India blamed Pakistan for that militant attack, saying that they had linkages to the attack. Claim Islamabad denied. But in the wider context of all of this, India has long blamed Pakistan for fostering terrorism in the region, in Indian-controlled Kashmir, and sort of fueling insurgency there, which Pakistan has repeatedly denied. So that is what led to the strikes that we saw earlier this week, where India sent missile strikes into Pakistan. And then day by day, a tit-for-tat retaliation, it just escalated from there, and very, very, very rapidly. So I think the ceasefire was a bit of a surprise for a lot of people, because just this morning we were hearing India and Pakistan both blaming the other side for drone strikes on army bases, each trading blame on that front as well, and news of the ceasefire.
That's CBC's Salima Shivji in Mumbai. And for his take, we're now joined by Sanjay Ruparela. He's an associate professor and Daruslavsky Democracy Chair at Toronto Metropolitan University. He's also an expert on Indian politics. Thank you so much for making time for us tonight.
Thanks for asking me to join you.
Tell me, Professor Ruparella, what do you think overall of this ceasefire deal? How real and lasting do you think it'll be?
Well, as your report just suggested, the ceasefire was brokered this morning. It was very welcome in many quarters. Surprising because we were worried about escalation, but there are reports now coming out of both Pakistan and India that there's still cross-border firing taking place. And that's been one of the aspects of this most recent flare-up of hostilities between India and Pakistan, is that there are claims and counterclaims. As we know, the truth often gets shrouded in context of armed conflict and war. And there has been a lot of disinformation on both sides as well. So it's important to verify independently what's actually taking place. But we have seen an escalation on various fronts. That's very worrying.
Yeah, truth is always one of the first casualties. I mean, the fact that these skirmishes took place, as you pointed out, mere hours after this truce was reached, what do you think is the motivation for that?
Well, I think, both sides, there's a lot of public pressure in both India and Pakistan to strike back, to have the last word, so to speak. And it's also the case that countries right now, the two governments are led by strongmen, self-defined strongmen, Prime Minister Modi in India, General Munir in Pakistan, and they're known to be more hardline figures in both their polities. And so they want to be seen as having the last word in this contest that's taking place in conflict. And that's the danger, that there's a lot to lose on both sides. And usually in the past, there's been a cycle in which there's an exchange of fire, maybe 2 rounds, 3 rounds, and then both sides sort of feel like they've won some kind of victory, at least in terms of public perception. And what's unclear in this case, because there's a number of ways in which this conflict has broken former old rules, that we're not sure where it's going to end.
Right. So you just mentioned a little bit about the history of these ceasefires, that there's often this, I guess, a display of power on part of both actors, and then things settle down. Would you say that this has generally been the tenor of how ceasefires have worked out between India and Pakistan? If you can walk us through a little bit of history here.
Well, the history, of course, goes back to partition. But I think for this conflict right now, the context is really 1999. There was a conflict, some called it a war, in Kargil, in which the United States under President Clinton intervened directly. 2001, there was a mass mobilization of troops on the border. Again, the United States intervened. This was after an attack on the Indian Parliament in 2001. In 2016, India also fired across into Pakistan after its troops were targeted in 2019. And what's different about this one is that usually it's been ground troops that have been involved, but now we see air power, we see drone activity, we see missiles, and we see India has breached far more deeply into Pakistan. Not just in Pakistan administered Kashmir, but into Punjab, which is really the heartland, the power base of the Pakistani state, targeting air defenses, and vice versa in the case of Pakistan striking India. So that's what's been worrying, the number of targets, the depth inside each country, the fact that air power is being used this has breached new grounds in this conflict.
Professor Ruparella, let's talk a little bit about the importance of U.S. stepping in. What do you think motivated it, and how much leverage does U.S. have over the Pakistani administration, given that U.S. has growing ties with India and growing ties between two men who see themselves as strongmen, Donald Trump and Prime Minister Modi of India? Do you think that U.S. has the power to actually influence Pakistan to abide by the terms of the truce?
That's right. So historically, the U.S. and Pakistan have had a long strategic alliance from the 1950s in the Cold War. It ramped up after 9/11. But with the fall of Kabul in 2021, the U.S.'s leverage and interest practically in Pakistan has diminished. So China has become the most important ally of Pakistan economically, in terms of security and diplomatically. In the case of India, as you said, growing strategic defense and economic ties over the last 2.5 decades. But India's always wanted to see this as a bilateral issue. And so it's very clear that President Trump declared that he was the mediator from this, but the Indian side didn't recognize that. They see it as a bilateral issue. It's been Pakistan historically that wants to so-called internationalize the issue, to bring in international mediation, because there's a huge asymmetry of power between Pakistan and India, in the conventional military terms, in the terms of the state and size of their economies and so on. So the U.S. has various interests. It didn't seem particularly engaged earlier in the week.
Right.
But Trump himself wants to claim some. And I have to say one thing, India is the most important country.
ரொம்ப முக்கியமான விஷயத்தை அசல்ட்டாக சொல்லிட்டாப்புல. எதனால் இந்தியா இதை வந்து ஒரு பைலேட்ரலாக டீல் பண்ணணும்னு நினைக்கிறாங்க, அண்ட் எதனால் பாகிஸ்தான் இதை இன்டர்நேஷ்னலைஸ் பண்ணணும்னு நினைக்கிறாங்க, இன்டர்நேஷ்னல் கம்யூனிட்டியோட பிளெஸிங் வேணும்னு நினைக்கிறாங்கிறத ரொம்ப அழகாக சிம்பிளாக முடிச்சு விட்டாப்புல. இந்தியாவோட ஷிம்லா அக்ரிமெண்ட் கூட போடப்பட்டிருக்கு. இந்தமாரி வந்து வாட் எவர் த இஷ்யூ ஆஃப் த காஷ்மீர் இட் ஹாஸ் டு பி டெல்ட் வித் பைலேட்ரல் நெகோஷியேஷன்ஸ் ஒன்லிங்கிற மாதிரி. பைலாட்டரலாக நம்ம உட்காந்து பேசி தான் முடிவு எடுக்கணுமே தவிர தேர்ட் பார்ட்டி யாரும் உள்ளே வரக்கூடாதுங்கிற மாதிரி ஆல்ரெடி போட்டு வச்சுருந்தாங்க. இட்ஸ் வெரி வேர்ல்ட் பாலிட்டிக்ஸை பார்க்க ரொம்ப வியப்பாக தான் இருக்குது. ஹவு டிஃப்ரெண்ட் பர்சன்ஸ் வாண்ட் டிஃப்ரெண்ட் திங்ஸ்.
United States in Asia in its rivalry with China. So I think it sees that it's not in its interest for India to be involved in this conflict with Pakistan. And frankly, for the last decade and a half. So I think it sees that it's not in its interest for India to be involved in this conflict with Pakistan. And frankly, for the last decade and a half, India has tried to so-called de-hyphenate itself from Pakistan, saying we're the major global power that's on the rise, and we have much bigger aspirations in the subcontinent. But this conflict has been there for decades, and so it's in the interest of both sides to sort of see an off-ramp in this conflict.
What role do you think, you just talked about the role of the broader international community beyond the US, what role do you think Canada can play? Canada is home to sizable diasporic communities of both Indian and Pakistani people, some of the biggest in the world. So certainly lots of people have family members there, are watching the situation unfold with some trepidation. What do you think Canada can do at this point?
I'm not sure there's much Canada can do. I mean, I think what we have to focus on is, as you say, there's very large diaspora communities in Canada. We have to make sure that there's attention to that, and that, you know, we sort of see conflicts have a transnational dimension. We want to make sure that there's an openness here to what's happening, and a sense of empathy for what many families would be going through, which is a great deal of fear that this could escalate into a full-out war. But the key countries for India and Pakistan would be the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia. India consulted the United Kingdom, but also Russia. It's long-standing, long-time. And so these are the key countries, and China, of course. So it's not clear at this stage what Canada could do. If it was a case that there was some kind of process to address some of these issues, that other nations were getting involved in some multilateral fora, then maybe Canada might play some kind of role. But I don't see it at this stage.
Professor Ruparelia, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm sure we'll be following this issue in the days to come, and perhaps you can join us again. Sanjay Ruparelia is an associate professor in politics and
comment sections are turned off. Why are tensions escalating over Kashmir? 2 days ago போட்டிருக்காங்க. ஸ்கை நியூஸ் புதுசாக கண்டுபிடிச்சிருக்கலாம், அதை போய் பார்ப்பாங்க. பாகிஸ்தானோட ஹை கமிஷனர் வந்திருக்காப்புல.
Hour about further explosions despite this ceasefire being announced earlier. Worrying news in the last hour about further hour about further explosions. Worrying news in the last hour about further.
நீ ரீலோடே ஆகுது. ஏன் இந்த திணறுது?